Today on RotoViz Overtime, it is a Dynasty Reanimator special. We are kind of doing a little bit of a mailbag as we dive into some listeners' submitted questions, from what to do with Puka Nacua if you have him. Should you trade him away? Should you still be trading for Sam Howell after his Week 3 performance? And what to do if your team is 0-3 and feels like it may be about to go 0-4? What should you be doing in those situations? And we will likely be squeezing in some conversation on what to do if league mates in your league aren't really open to trade conversation. So looking forward to today's show, along with my co-host, as always, Shawn Siegele. Shawn, we're entering NFL Week 4. It is kind of that first, it feels like, post in the season where you can really take stock and evaluate where your teams are going, but it's always helpful to do that every single week to see as things move along. But today we're kind of going to be evaluating some of these teams, some of these moves, and linking it in with some of our teams as well to see what we can do to either have success. Success looks different for all teams. If it's a team that is 0-3, success can be really building and getting ahead of the curve for the 2024 season. So there's lots of ways to look at success, but hopefully the OT community out there is looking to have a successful championship season in 2023. But how are you feeling as we're approaching NFL Week 4 here?
Colm, you get to Week 4 here, and you look across your various teams, and unless the season has gone absolutely perfectly with no injuries, then you have a bunch of teams that look really good, like the teams that you and I have together. That's always fun when we're hanging out and doing the show. You have some teams that are in the middle, and you'll have maybe that one or two teams where everything has gone wrong and they need a lot of renovation. Certainly if you're in a redraft situation, those teams are not necessarily dead. I always like to tell the story of
I was going to say it's an interesting season as well, because if we look at some of the highest scorers at certain positions this season so far, you know, at wide receiver with Puka being in there, even our best ball teams, there's a lot of best ball landscapes that are going to shift dramatically over the rest of the course of the season, based on some of those top performers having maybe not performed to the top levels of their ability yet, and maybe we have some outliers at different positions so far. So those teams may still be able to work their way back into it. But Shawn, you were going to tell us a story. What was it before I interrupted?
Well, just a team that was a 0 RB team that scores 42 points in Week 1. And you're looking at that and you're thinking, okay, well, I missed on the receivers, I missed on the contingent running back picks. You know, this is going to be a long season. Maybe 0 RB doesn't even work. And then that team blitzed to an easy title as you went on. Now, we're 3 weeks in, so you're getting a little bit more information than that. I'm looking at my worst main event team, and the positive is that it does have Tua. And so you feel pretty good about the upside that you have at QB. But it's one of these teams where, because of where I was positioned in the draft, it did make sense to go with that 1-2 turn of wide receiver, and then get some of those fun running backs in the next handful of rounds. And so that team has set on a Garrett Wilson. That play isn't working out, obviously. Has a Jaylen Waddle. That play is going to work out almost for sure. But if you have it so far, then it's been hurting you. And so that's one where you're just being patient. But if you combine that with the Breece Hall situation, so you have both Hall and Garrett Wilson, that's a problem. If it's a J.K. Dobbins team, then you've lost those points. And then Colm, Ben and I just did a long show on running back, the guys who are going to rise, the guys who are going to fall, where we're looking through 3 weeks, where we're going to be at the end of the season. One of the players who is the most controversial and interesting right now is Ramondre Stevenson. And certainly it's been bad so far, and it's uncertain going forward. There's still a lot of potential positives, but if that player is on the team, then you're looking at that and you're saying, I mean, this has gone about as poorly as it can. And if you had an injury, you're not going to get that player back, but also the situation with the Jets, very, very dark. So we don't stop competing, but you're going to be reasonable about what some of the expectations are. Now that team has a George Kittle at a great price. It does have those Dolphins. It's got a lot of interesting bench depth. So the future could be a lot brighter, but there's that combination of understanding that you hit on your mix of sort of worst priority players to go with a situation now where you're off to a slow start. So that going to be a little bit problematic. You contrast that with the teams that have hit on the better mix. We've got a lot of teams that are in first place in best ball. Colm, you and I are in good shape in our main event. We are 3-0 and have gotten the total or the top total number of victory points in our FFPC Dynasty League. We have 12. The next closest team is at 9. That team is really exciting. Obviously, if you play not a huge number of leagues, but a variety of leagues, then you get to evaluate your portfolio a little bit better. If you just have a couple of teams, you can be in the spot where you just have your best team or just have your worst team, and it's a little bit misleading. So I like where we are, big picture, to be at this point and have a lot of guys who should rise. I'm excited about that. But we also are looking to figure out how we can improve teams of all different stripes. So how do we improve our worst teams and get them ready to make that push in midseason? How do we maybe move into a little bit more of a rebuilding mode in dynasty teams where there are some real problems? And one of the things we're going to talk about on the show today is how you can kind of craft this multi-path approach to help for the present. And if you start to hit, then you can pivot very quickly back into competing, but you're going to position yourself to get a lot of value out of this year as it relates to the future, right? So to be able to do both of those things. And then also our teams that are good teams, how do we make sure we continue to pile on and give them the best chance to either win dynasty titles? Obviously, you can't do anything with your best ball teams, but you're thinking through, what's going to work and what's not. And then for your redraft teams, how do we make this push either with start sit, with free agency, with trades to get them ready to go win their leagues or to go win $1 million?
Yeah, I agree. And the other part is, Shawn, week 5 is where the bye weeks start to kick in. And, sometimes these rosters, particular rosters with depth, that is when they're really going to start to fire ahead of some of the competition. So there is chances in those situations to really push on over the next 5-6 weeks. And if you're not in the hunt right now, get yourself back in the mix. But it's also important that if you're in a team that is not going to compete this year, if maybe you took over a Orphan Dynasty team this offseason, like this first one we're going to talk about that comes in from Matt, there is situations where you are consistently at this point already looking ahead to 2024. So this particular one, we did talk about this team maybe 2 months ago, but a lot of moves have been made since then. It is obviously very much in a rebuild stage, but improving all the time. But the main focus, Shawn, of this question comes in around potentially, gaining a quarterback in Sam Howell, but also having to move on one of the hottest starters of the season in Puka. So it's a roster that at the moment, you talked about a dark timeline, Shawn, in New York. This roster has Zach Wilson on it. Will Levis is there. Obviously hasn't done anything so far. Aiden O'Connell with the Las Vegas Raiders. Ryan Tannehill. So quarterback is going to need work. It's going to need time to come along as the season goes on. But at wide receiver, it does have Dobbs, has Bateman, Nico Collins, Josh Downs, Jonathan Mingo, Puka, and then Trey Palmer along with Michael Wilson. So, Shawn, when we look at this particular offer, he mentions that he has a long way to go with this team, but he has now gathered up 2 firsts, 3 seconds, 13 picks in next year's 2024 draft overall. He did get Puka off waivers, and I've been shopping him around to see if he can get a first-round pick for that. I have seen some first-round picks be gained for Puka over the last, particularly after week 2, but we'll see what happens over the next season. The best offer he's been able to get is Puka and Tannehill for Howell and a second. Says he knows that you and Shawn talk often about how folks overvalue quarterbacks in this format, but he mentioned that we are obviously high on Howell. A lot of people listening to the show over the summer will have known that. You're saying, how would we view that potential trade, which seems fair to him, but he felt like it still might not be worth it for his roster. I did question him, Shawn, on the Puka deal. He did mention that he had turned over a lot of this roster on waivers prior to NFL week 1. Obviously, the waivers have been closed in the FFPC up to that point. Turned over a lot of the roster, got on a lot of players. He had a $1 contingent bid on Puka that week, but obviously he wasn't the player that got selected. He ended up winning the higher cost bid, but he spent $627 on him a week later. So there is a bit of difference, but he did get his man. He also got Kyron Williams after week 1, and he flipped him for 2 picks after that week 1 kind of scenario, which was a 3rd and a 5th. but that was at a point where it was pre the Cam Akers news, and he felt like after picking him up, it was a kind of quick flip to make some moves there. But realistically, Shawn, what we're talking about here is the value, obviously, of Puka, who we talked about last week, where you have him up into those top 15 wide receivers in your dynasty rankings, and then Sam Howell, who we talk very, very highly about as well. Tannehill for me, and this is, I won't say it's a non-factor, but it's really, for me, Howell and the second for Puka in this one. Where would you be leaning on this particular scenario for a rebuilding roster?
Well, one of the things that we mentioned last week when we were going through the dynasty values is that we still had to wait a few more weeks before we could really solidify Howell in his spot. You were suggesting maybe he could go higher. We're saying he could go higher, but he could also go lower. And then we had to, in some ways, represent the wide range of outcomes that he still represented. And unfortunately, we get about as bad a performance as you can possibly get. And that increases the risk, right? Increases the range of outcomes even further, because now we're right back to that situation where he could get benched. And I do think that the NFL is in a position where there's such a tight market for quarterbacks that someone who does what Sam Howell can do is always going to be in demand. The only way that it really doesn't work out is if you get benched and for whatever reason the team doesn't believe in you and yet also feels like it's valuable enough to them to keep you stashed and won't move you. One of the reasons that we like Howell is that he moves the ball and he has plus arm strength and plus athleticism. And sometimes the issue there is that for a quarterback who is inexperienced and has poor blocking, you're going to run into a situation where those guys take a ton of sacks because they don't want to give up on plays. And then if you don't give up on the play early enough, you take a sack, right? Because you can't be in the middle of that throw and get hit, get injured, and create more turnovers. Now he's also had a problem with turnovers, both fumbles and interceptions. But the important note about the arm strength and the athleticism and the ability to move the ball is that contrast with where the Jets are. Now, when you look at the Jets, I mean, they're in a situation where, I mean, as I was thinking through this, really what I would love is for there to be some way, shape, or form for the Panthers, who are not competitive, to have a different backup there for Bryce Young and move Andy Dalton to the Jets, because that would be fantastic. I mean, you watched what Andy Dalton did last week, getting the ball to Adam Thielen, right? And to Miles Sanders. You think of what Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall could do with the type of quarterback play that the Panthers got from Andy Dalton last week, and you're like, please help us move these guys to spots where it would help the various teams.
It feels like that could be like Ryan Fitzpatrick 2.0. We could have
it's so perfect
from Andy Dalton.
One thing that you know when you go through and look at the actual quarterback performances from last year, and part of this is just how good Chris Olave was, but Andy Dalton was really good with the New Orleans Saints last year. And so, I mean, the reason that he is no longer a starting quarterback is because he's old, right? If you have that ability in your 20s, then you're going to be starting for different teams because they're thinking about the potential growth and upside and long term. So, one of the possibilities here would be that the Commanders sour on Howell and move him to the Jets. Now, I mean, all of these things are somewhat far-fetched in terms of the individual scenario, but my point is simply that I would be continuing to acquire Howell anytime that his price is down, knowing that it can continue to go down beyond that, but that there also are so many different scenarios in which it becomes rehabilitated later, right? You look at this particular trade, and the part that jumps out to me is that you can win in two ways, which is that, or really you can win in three ways. Now, I've been really impressed with Puka. He finally does have a little bit of a lesser game in week 3. That's inevitable. I mean, even the superstars don't go and catch 10 plus balls every single week. And if he had just rolled another couple of yards there. He gets in the end zone, and we're like, oh, this guy is absolutely unstoppable. He's not going to have the huge games every week. You're going to have Cooper Kupp hopefully coming back. That's probably going to knock him down in the intermediate term. But, I mean, the scenario or the situation for Puka is still really, really good. So I wouldn't be in any hurry to get rid of him. But if you make the trade, then one of the ways that you potentially win is that his value does, diminish over the next couple of months to where it's down to where, it's just kind of a roster filler. I don't expect that, but we have to consider that that is still possible. The two big ways that you can win are for Howell to give you a quarterback. And it's so difficult to acquire quarterbacks in these Superflex leagues. We talk about how the managers who spend up to get the stars can really limit the overall value of their roster over the long term. But that doesn't mean that you're not trying to get, especially the guys who are interesting, the guys who have sort of a wide range of outcomes. You want to stockpile as many of those guys as you can, right? So you can win through Howell, but you can also win through that round 2 piece. And I mean, you think about some of the names that we put out there as being really high value round 2s in this year that just passed, where the draft wasn't even that strong, right? But we wanted to get Sam Laporta in every draft. We did that. His value has now skyrocketed. We wanted to get a lot of Rashee Rice. I've been encouraged by him. Again, he was tackled inside the 1 twice last week. If he gets in on those, people feel a little bit even more excited about him than they probably already do. Marvin Mims, the third guy there. I mean, he looks absolutely unstoppable. And Marvin Mims looks like a superhero. And you're like, get him involved in the rest of the game.
Sounds all three of those going to be more involved going forward. Sounds very positive, Shawn.
Good. So those, 3 what look like big hits. Certainly Mims and Laporta look like they're going to be huge hits. The fourth one there, Michael Mayer, that one has been weird and disappointing. I still am excited that we have those shares. And then you think about guys who would be kind of the next small tier breakdown. Devon Achane and Kendre Miller, 2 names that we really like there, who came in below the players we targeted, but were still also targets, right? So you're thinking, well, what if I get a round 2 pick, but I don't get exactly my guy? What if I don't get the Sam Laporta? Well, it wasn't just Laporta who would have helped you. You look at the first, say, 8 picks of round 2, and there were a lot of names in there that were exciting. The round 2 picks in Superflex, number 1, you want to stockpile, and then number 2, you want to work through your prospect evaluation in a way that you're making sure that you're getting the kind of exposure to upside plays that help you win. And so it feels a lot less comfortable to say after such a poor performance from Howell, but I do think that that's a trade I would feel good about, because it's not just reliant on Howell. That's what you want to do when you're constructing these trades, is make sure you have multiple ways that you can win, knowing your own fallibility, knowing the potential for injury. When you have that humility-based approach that gives you 2 paths, I really like those. That's how you end up with the super teams, because you are going to hit on a variety of your priority pieces, and you work through the roster, you build it up from top to bottom that way.
Yeah, obviously it was a very, very tough week last week in a situation where it was very pass dependent against the Bills. Once they got behind and stayed behind, obviously get absolutely crushed in that game. They do face the Philadelphia Eagles this week, Shawn, which is probably not going to help the scenario, where they're probably going to be behind in this one, and the Eagles defense is a very tough one to call. So it may be another tough week coming up here for Howell, but we'll see what happens. But on the flip
if there was
side
one
of that,
game that you wanted to play right after you have had a nightmarish performance, I do think the Eagles would be the dead last team that you would pick.
The only one thing you can say is sometimes if your team's behind, there's a lot of garbage time there, but we had that last week, Shawn, and the points were not put up in garbage time for the Commanders. But the other side of that, I'm sure there's people listening in and they're probably shouting at it. Maybe they've acquired Puka, or maybe they're looking to acquire him. Is there any hesitancy to be moving him at this point in terms of where his potential value could ascend to? Or is it the opposite in terms of Cooper Kupp may be back next week, for example, and maybe what we've seen in week 3 is more of what we can expect, going forward, rather than what we've seen in week 1 and 2?
No, I mean, he was pretty clearly the defensive focal point and still put up yardage. I mean, at this point, you don't want to give him up for anything less than a serious offer. I think that for me, the Howell plus a second is a better package than a first round pick. Now, if you're saying that the first round pick that you're looking at is, or in terms of how you're thinking about first round picks, is you're sort of restricting yourself to first round picks that are going to be in the top 6, that makes it maybe a little bit different. Or if you're saying the second round pick is almost certainly going to be in that 209 to 212 range, then maybe that's a little bit different. But in some of these cases, if you're talking about something that could be the 109 versus something that could be the 203, I mean, you're going to outpick your opponents and you're going to be fine there. And the two selections, the two chances to win versus the risk of having a first round pick. I mean, I don't think that these guys are necessarily going to be busts, but I mean, you look about the previous year and, if you drafted Sky Moore, is that better than having a random second round pick? I mean, it's obviously not. If you are in this particular draft and you're just looking back right away, I mean, do you really clearly like Dalton Kincaid over a second round pick for next season? I don't necessarily think that you do. Do you very clearly like Quentin Johnston over a second round pick from next season? I'm not sure that you do. And we like those guys. That's not to say that they're going to be busts. I mean, we're 3 games in. A lot could happen. And yet you do already have some information, which is that this scenario where Kincaid is the guy playing off of Stephon Diggs in the way that Laporta is doing in Detroit, we haven't gotten that yet. That doesn't mean we're not going to. It's 3 weeks. But if you drafted Kincaid above a Jordan Addison, the potential for him to go off right away was one of the reasons you did that. You look at Quentin Johnston, when you drafted him where you drafted him, being the number 2 within the first month and not have it be because of a Mike Williams injury, I mean, those were things that you were looking at as possibilities. And so you still have a very wide range of outcomes, but it's shifted a little bit to the negative. Now, that first round pick, if it becomes a Bijan Robinson or a CJ Stroud, then, you're probably pretty happy with it. So again, it's not to say that round 1s are not more valuable, but when you're looking at 2 valuable pieces, even if their ranges are centered at a lower point and maybe are wider, you can win with that if you have the right type of player evaluation.
The next question, Shawn, that we're going to go into is around teams who may now be, you mentioned the main event scenario where things may be not going well, but there's a lot of people out there that may have dynasty teams that have yet to, fully hit their peak. This team in particular it's a Breece Hall team. It also has Jaylen Waddle. And, you get those players like Quentin Johnston you're after mentioning mixed in there. Mark Andrews hasn't hit the heights and has missed a game. So we can see how this team may be starting to struggle to start the season. They are 0-3. He mentions that in week 4, he is facing one of the top 2 teams. So he feels like he's about to go 0-4. So we're going to dive into what potentially you could do. But this is also an interesting scenario where he did make some big moves this offseason to address the quarterback position. And he went all in to acquire Justin Fields. He feels at this point, obviously, with how the season has started, that he is drastically overpaid. And it feels like it was he uses the phrase colossal failure of a trade. But again, you mentioned it is only 3 weeks in. I have mentioned on some of the shows my concerns around Justin Fields moving forward, but there is also the possibility, like we're talking about with Howell, that there is a wide range of outcomes, and we have seen the talent he has, so we may get back to where we were in his rookie season or last season again as we move forward here. But he mentioned that he felt that he had elite studs and depth at all the key positions and went all in this year. He feels like he's a bit stuck now and would appreciate our advice. Does he hold on to his stud players? Does he go into a fire sale mode to accumulate draft capital for a rebuild? He did move his 2024 first, second, and third as part of the deal to get Justin Fields. So with the awful luck to start the season, that means that heading into the draft in 2024, where we'll be looking to have stockpiled some of those potential pick options, he has a 3 fifths, a 6th, and a 7th. So limited draft capital as we move forward. The team is Dak Prescott, Justin Fields, he has Howell, he has Trey Lance at running back, it is Breece, Barkley, Chubb, who obviously is now on IR, Dobbins, who is on IR, he has Wilson, Breida, Fournette, Chase Brown, Craig Reynolds at wide receiver, AJ Brown, Devontae Smith, Jaylen Waddle, Deebo Samuel, Quentin Johnston, Michael Wilson, Zay Jones, Curtis Samuel. And then at tight end, he has Mark Andrews and Chig Okonkwo. in terms of like, I've named out some of them there, and people may have, heard what we were talking. As I went through it there, people would probably have, noticed, but both Dobbins and Chubb are on IR. He's lost Barkley for those couple of games to the high ankle sprains, lost Waddle. So there's a lot, Shawn, to dive into here in terms of the main focus is what to do in terms of keeping players, I guess, or moving them, looking ahead already to next season. He does mention that the Zach Wilson experiment will fail in New York, and that should help Breece to rebound. But he says his gut is to stay the course and hope Fields is a similar rebound after last year's tough starts or something similar to that. This year, he says, thanks in advance for your advice. That question comes in from Craig. So, Shawn, there's a lot here, a lot of moving parts. You touched on some of them with the likes of Quentin Johnson, who now hopefully will be more involved in the offense with the unfortunate injury to Mike Williams. There's just a huge amount of things that have kind of also gone wrong for this team in terms of early season. You start the season with Breece Hall, Barkley, Chubb, Dobbins. You're in a situation where you have Breece breaking off long runs in week 1, but Rodgers has already gone down at that point. You get Barkley looking fantastic, picks up the high ankle sprain at the end of that game against Arizona. You have Chubb, who obviously is now out for the season. You have Dobbins out for the season. And then you have also those kind of issues that have caused some of the players like a Mark Andrews or a Waddle to not be at 100%. So lots of things going on here. Feels like a pretty good roster, but sometimes that injury luck and the luck in general can be very tough. What is your thoughts as we look at this? This feels like a team that the season could turn around even after losing out on Dobbins and Chubb. The team still has enough depth, I think, to maybe start to sneak back into it.
This is a tough one because once you've moved your own picks, you have limited some of your pathways to success. You'd really like to move your veterans here, get a lot of value, be in competition for the 101, the 201. Both of those picks obviously would be extremely valuable. I'm in a similar situation in one of my leagues where I did do something I rarely do at this point, which is to move the first round pick on a team where I was going to be able to use that to get guys like Mims and Laporta, Rice. Excited about how that's working out. The team is 0-3 despite really not even having problems. It's just sort of the way that it's worked out. It's got 2 of my top 4 rated players in Jaylen Hurts and Bijan Robinson. And you're looking at that and you're saying, I mean, if really the team is fine, the players are good, the outlook is excellent, I mean, you wouldn't start tanking after 3 weeks anyway, right? But when you look at some of the small tweaks that you can make after you've moved your own first round pick, trying to get in position to get Caleb Williams now no longer works as well. But even though you don't have that path, I think that you want to do what we talked about in the intro, which is to create multiple ways the season can work out for you. And for me, the very first thing to do would be to assess the market for Prescott, who for me has been wildly overvalued in Superflex. I think that if you can move him, then you start not necessarily a rebuild, but a reload. And you don't necessarily have to get a QB back if you have both Fields and Howell. Because one of the things that you kind of need to have happen here anyway is that you need Fields to bounce back. If he doesn't bounce back, then your season is more or less tanked. And so you don't need Dak on top of that. You're going to go with both Fields and Howell. And then worst case scenario, you can go with Fields and a non-QB in that Superflex spot. Right. So we're going to create some flexibility by moving the quarterback who has a lot of value and is dramatically overvalued. The thing I would have recommended against would be picking up Trey Lance. You don't really want to burn roster spots in shallow dynasty leagues on your backups. You want your QB to stay healthy. And if he doesn't, then you make those moves later on. Trey Lance should not be rostered in a RotoViz Triflex League where everybody only has 20 roster spots. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to be the case in all of the leagues because you do have someone with this hybrid background, but everything that the 49ers were telling us is that Trey Lance can't play at all. I mean, they have him behind Sam Darnold, right? They wanted to get rid of him. Trey Lance is probably closer to a Zach Wilson type of player than he is even to a Sam Howell type of player. Now, we didn't get to see much of him, so we're not going to say that definitively. But when you didn't actually have basically any passing experience in college, and then the team that spent so much to go get you sours on you almost instantly, that is really bad news, right? And so I think that you can also move Lance. Now, the fact that Lance went like in round 12 of the dynasty startup that Bjorn and I did recently, and we haven't gotten any new news on him since then. I mean, you can move both Dak and Lance. You can move him to the same manager. You can move him to different managers, but you want to get some of the QB value back out of it. And then, Colin, the secondary thing that we want to do is start looking at these running backs who don't set up to really help you this season. So can you move a J.K. Dobbins? You may not be able to, but you want to at least explore that. Can you move a Saquon Barkley, who, I mean, he's scored well so far, but that can be fluky in the course of the Giants' offense has looked terrible. He now has the type of injury where you kind of expect re-aggravation, and for him to be playing at less than 100%, he's getting up there in age. His dynasty value is almost certainly going to go down and down and down. You try and move him. Can you move a Nick Chubb? I mean, one of the problems with making some of these moves for elite older running backs is that if you have a Dobbins and you can't move him, it's not great because his injury has such a long timeline that he's actually not going to be young by the time that he comes back. But there still is some potential there. When you have guys like Chubb and Barkley get hurt, then, I mean, their value goes not necessarily to zero, but they're not in a position to take an injury and retain value. And so we want to try and preemptively. And so this would be something for, all the listeners who are like, I don't have this team. I don't care what this manager should do. Preemptively, you want to be thinking about how you can arrange your roster so that you have running back firepower, but you are not creating so much exposure to injuries that take a guy's value down to almost nothing. How do we continue to churn to accomplish that? You could probably also try and make a move with Debo, who is coming off of a really good game that allows people to see, again, what he brings. And yet we know that there are risks there with Ayuk in the equation, with Kittle in the equation, with Debo's own injuries, with the age that he's getting up to. I get very wide range of Debo trade offers. And the very fact that people are willing to send you such like dramatically lowball offers gives you a sense that, I mean, those managers' opinions are going to be factored into the overall market for him, even though they're obviously not the target for you. You're not going to sell them that low. If you have managers in your league who are willing to pay at the top end, that's a move that makes sense. I think that you can move Quentin Johnston on the fact now that Mike Williams is out. We've gotten some pretty negative information really on Johnston, and that's super disappointing to me. I was excited for him. But if you have someone who's willing to, again, pay the top end of the market, you can eliminate a little bit of your risk that by the time the season ends, that Johnston is already in this kind of Sky Moore type of category. Again, that's not to say sell low, but you want to be discussing the different options with everyone in your league, and you find the very highest manager on those individual players. And if those managers are in the market for a guy, you can make those moves. In a league that is as shallow as these FFPC leagues are, I mean, you can actually address your roster to a decent extent just through free agency as the season goes along. So you don't even necessarily have to get players back to keep open the possibility of being competitive this year. So you can do that, and yet still you're going to have Breece Hall. You're going to have Jeff Wilson. He's got some interesting names at the end of the running back bench. You're going to have A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith and Jaylen Waddle. You're going to have these guys at the end of the wide receiver bench. You're going to have Mark Andrews. There's a possibility that the Titans offense doesn't stay as dramatically bad as it's been. So you have Puka Nacua. You're not going to completely tank yet, but you're going to look for the possibility to get some value back, because if you don't make any of these types of moves, you sit there, you don't make the playoffs, and you don't have the 2024 picks, and you're going to be waiting for 2025. It's problematic because, not to say that these guys won't be better again next year. Again, this is a very good roster, but players like Dak, like Barkley, like Chubb, like Dobbins, like Debo, they're going to be worth less to you next year. And so even with the players starting the season healthy, your window has going to be closed to an extent. So again, I would have recommended against a few of these moves, but I certainly understand why they would have been made. I actually don't have any problem with the Fields acquisition. Again, you don't necessarily want to give up your 2023 or your 2024, first. But paying a lot for Fields, I think, is something that makes more sense than just having Dak on the roster in the first place, because Fields is a guy with the rushing value that even if he fails in 2023 in Chicago, which looks fairly likely, even though we know he bounced back last year, Fields even much more than Howell. I mean, what scenarios are there where a team isn't going to want to have him? Right? He's got too big of an arm. He's too athletic. He can move the ball simply by rushing. And every season, there are going to be 5, 6, 7 head coaches who are just like,
I can fix it.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar to the thing with Sean Payton and what he said about last year's Broncos coaching staff, where he's like, these guys did the worst job in NFL history. Obviously, the offense under me is going to be fine. That, I mean, one of the things that has been such a disaster for the Bears is that the internal conflict and turmoil already has been ratcheted up to a level that doesn't work for an NFL team, where the players are just flat out saying the coaching is terrible. And other NFL coaches are also thinking to themselves, the coaching is terrible. If I had Justin Fields, then he's going to be a weapon. He's not necessarily going to be Jalen Hurts or someone who takes you to the Super Bowl, but he's going to be an exciting player who does so much more than what he's doing with the Chicago Bears. Yeah, it's certainly a big problem for your 2023 prospects, but I don't think that moving Fields low or being worried about having Fields for the long-term success of your roster, that part of it I don't think is a huge problem.
Yeah, I definitely don't think, the question it mentions a fire sale. I'm not really looking to move unless the offer is exceptional. Those players like a Devontae Smith, Waddle, for example. But when you get into players, and if you start to look ahead now to 2024 and you're thinking of these players as what they will be worth in 2024, I think as the season goes on, Dak Prescott's value is going to continue to go down. I think more things will show some of the struggles that he's going to have moving forward. And then players like Barkley, players like Debo will be 28 years old, I believe, in January. You have, Chubb coming back from the injury, Dobbins, and they're injured, so it might be hard to get proper value. Maybe the best time to move those guys is going to be next off season when you're heading down the stretch into the preseason time. But the likes of a Barkley, the likes of a Debo, I think would make sense with Dak to move at this point if possible, because of where that team and where they will be when you're in that 2024 range. It is the missing picks makes it very tough there. But thanks to Craig for sending in that question. Hopefully that'll help him. Hopefully some of the strategy we talked through there will help people who maybe are in a similar situation or just thinking of their dynasty strategy in general. But the last question, Shawn, comes in with trying to make those trade offers. So it is how to deal with owners who never offer a trade first. They always wait and then they decline without counters or go on to criticize your offer. He has in brackets, not a low baller by any means. Avoid them completely in future. He said he hates to cut potential trade partners, but it is getting frustrating. If you're in a league, and most leagues are going to be 12-team leagues, and if it's a case, then there's only 11 other owners in that situation, and then obviously if you're cutting one of those out, you are limiting some of the possibilities. Shawn, what's some of your thoughts on basically situations where it may be almost impossible to open those lines of communications or complete a trade with an individual manager in your league? And I guess a part of this could be good is the league we're in at the moment is much, much quieter than it was earlier this offseason, where we were trading quite freely, and we were thinking there's going to be a lot of trading in this league. And then we've used this phrase a lot, Shawn, in the first 3 weeks of the season, but then the tap was turned off.
Our league has worked well, has been nice. And the RV leagues over at the FFPC, one of the reasons they are a lot of fun is that the managers are very active. Every once in a while, you'll run into someone who's not that friendly. It's interesting because you have the worst situation than this is when you have someone who is obviously not going to trade with you because they don't make any fair trades, but they're somehow able to browbeat or trick the weak managers in the league into making a bunch of lopsided trades in their favor. I had one recently where we're trying to get down to the cut down, and so I'm negotiating with a fellow who isn't afraid to maybe behave in a way that is a little more objectionable. We didn't end up getting the trade. I had sent him a modified version of it later to see if he was still interested in that player at all, because the player's value had fallen. And so I offered him a much more favorable deal. And instead of getting a response of, no, the player's value has fallen below that, the response is a diatribe about how hilarious it is that I didn't give him the early trade and how, they came out on top, and like, good luck now having to spend the year with this player that you didn't trade him and all that kind of thing, which, again, it depends on how you'd like to interact with your fellow human beings and what your objectives are.
Not the manager, the player.
Well, we were trying to work out a trade for Sky Moore. He was on my team. I'm trying to get down and had multiple Chiefs receivers. And so you're like, what's the value at which you're willing to give up the scenarios in which Moore does take a step if you also have some other guys and you don't want to move off of the one guy that hits? And so the other part of the response that was humorous was saying, good luck burning all those roster spots on Chiefs receivers. So again, you can understand where that's coming from. It could be a situation where it ends up being suboptimal to burn roster spots in a shallower league on Chiefs receivers. Personally, I don't have any problem with having guys like Justin Ross and certainly Rashee Rice on the team. I'm very excited about how it's going to go forward. But you work through that, and it's like, does a person never offering you good trades, what do you do with that? Does a person just like consistently being nasty on purpose? How much does that influence how you're going to be willing to trade with them? And I guess my thought would be that don't waste a bunch of time with managers who either don't understand the trade market or don't care that much about the trade market. And the thing that you have to understand is that, that's not that unusual, where the player who has the guy on their roster in the first place is most likely to be the manager who has the highest valuation on them. So they're going to be the farthest away from the market. And when you make a market offer, they may still be offended by that because they're like, I have this player because I think they're better than what everybody else thinks. So that comes into play. So when you get this response that, no, they don't like that offer, you can't be offended by that. You have to understand where they're coming from. And yet, you will have managers who will put out the trade note where they're like, I'm open for business. Let me know what you want to do. And you're like, give me something to work with, right? Like, make an offer that we can make a fair counter to, or counter the offers that we do make. There's time involved. There is sort of emotional capital involved in working through these trades. If you've got someone who won't work with you, then I guess I would focus mostly on the other managers. But I do think that reacting in a friendly way, even if you get something nasty, continuing to send offers, if you do it quickly and don't expect much, if the offer makes sense for you and that manager, go ahead and send it out quickly. it's going to get rejected in most cases, but you never know what could open the door. Sometimes you'll get a trade offer in your box that isn't exactly what you were looking for because you are high on someone and you're low on somebody else, and you get an offer that doesn't make sense for your own rankings, and you've had a terrible day. And you see that, and your first initial reaction is just, come on, I don't. So you want to resist the temptation to send anything negative back to someone else, but you also want to understand that they may be in the midst of a horrible day. And so when they're sending something back to you saying, how could you ever send me this? It may be more about the person who just rear-ended them and, they had to spend hours getting their car fixed than it is about your trade. So those things come into play. But the reason that we're trying to create as many positive relationships as we can in as many leagues as we can, and maybe that's 6 managers in one league, 7 managers in another, only 3 in this league, but 8 in another one, is that those are going to be the people that you can work out mutually beneficial trades with, since not everybody in your league is going to, the unfortunate fact of the matter is that 2 or 3 people in almost every league either see player evaluation so differently than you do, and you're never going to be able to come to a common point, or they don't have an interest in making trades, or something that happened upset them and they don't want to trade with you specifically. You're going to have those managers who simply never work with you. And the most frustrating thing is when they are consistently feeding other people's rosters. And there's a manager in the league that Blair and I are in where the fact of the matter, the sad fact of the matter is just that he or she is not good at what they're doing. And so every trade that they've made has torpedoed their roster further. And in some ways, you just wish that the trades would stop, because nobody should be able to benefit quite that way. You don't necessarily want to go in and exploit that manager, because that's just not the way you do things in life. But it is a fun one or a frustrating one where Blair and I make a bunch of fair offers that are rejected. And then like today, this manager traded Geno Smith and Matthew Stafford for Tony Pollard. In a case where they're not competitive this year, they have no picks for next year, and now they have no quarterbacks. And so you're trying to figure out like what possible pathway that's going to open up. You've got to be okay with the fact that there are going to be managers in your league who do things that don't benefit you and are not appropriate, but there really isn't any recourse. So I guess that would be the general way to look at it. It's just, keep pursuing fair trades, keep being friendly with everyone. And, when someone sends you something nasty, send them a nice note back. Maybe it fixes their day, and maybe it fixes the relationship.
Yeah, the main thing there, Shawn, take away from it is it's nice to be nice to people, and building those relationships is the most important part. But the interesting part there, when you were saying that maybe you've had a bad day and you get this offer, I was thinking, you said your first reaction is, and I was wondering, was Shawn going to say, send them a strongly worded email? But that wasn't where it went. But yeah, it can be a case, and I've in the past, Shawn, had offers that I've sent and people have replied and said, what are you thinking? This is ridiculous. And I've replied to them and I was like, I didn't mean any offense from it. I was just sent the offer. I've sent out loads of offers today, and they come back and they said, sorry that I replied the way I did. I was just having a really bad day. So sometimes it is a case that that's the way it's going. And we were able to send a few emails back and forward, and hopefully it improved his day. It certainly improved my feeling from thinking that, this person really did not want to negotiate with me any further ever again, to a point where we had a nice friendly conversation. So hopefully that will help with people having trades. You cannot really, it's very hard to be in a situation where everybody in the league wants to trade with you. And then, Shawn, it can be tricky as well. I'm sure it happens to you sometimes, but when people know the players that you want to target, or you send an offer and they're like, no, I'm just going to hold on to him for another few weeks. Like I was just, a couple of leagues, I was just like sending DeAndre Swift, offers like crazy before week 1. And I was like, no, I'll just hold him. Then after week 1, and trying to get, no, I'll just hold him and see. And you're like, I just want him, just give him to me. And now it's like, yeah, you've no chance of ever making that offer. But there's like this little bit of like, well, they want him for a reason, so I'm just going to hold him here. And then they can make fun of you for the rest of the season in your home league when they don't trade him to you. And they probably beat you because of those players throughout the season. So all part of the fun and games of fantasy football.
It is. And we had the question in the middle there about, how to approach a team that's had these injuries. And one of the players on the roster was Jaylen Waddle. Just as a reminder, as an actionable takeaway at the end here for listeners who have made it through the first 50 minutes, this is a really good week to make an offer for Jaylen Waddle. Now, don't make silly offers because you're just going to get those rejected. Successful managers in competitive leagues understand that Jaylen Waddle has a lot of value and that Miami Dolphins offense being so good means that he's going to score. But there is still the emotional portion of it where you've missed a guy. He had 2 bad weeks to start. His team is blown up. You feel like you've missed out on all of that. And that's difficult emotionally. So you're more down on him than it makes sense to be objectively. If you make a fair offer for him, you have a chance to peel him away in some leagues this week. I think Jaylen Waddle has immense upside for the rest of the season.
And that is, for anyone listening, the secret in future. Listen all the way through the podcast. Shawn will drop a nugget in the last kind of 90 seconds for you. But another player who might kind of fit into that a little bit, maybe not to the same extreme, but T. Higgins. I think we have a lot of frustrated, dynasty managers potentially with what happened last year and how this season has started, even though we had the big week 2. But that is going to do it for this edition of the show. We will be back on Monday with our recap show Monday afternoon. Hopefully, NFL week 3 again was fantastic. We kind of said that there was going to be more points in week 3 after week 2. Now we're heading into week 4, Shawn. There's going to be more points this week. It's just going to be another extravaganza. It's going to continue throughout the entire season. I'm kind of excited for a weird reason, Shawn, for this Sunday is the Disney Channel is covering the London game this year, and it's Toy Story themed. So I'm going to try and get my daughter to watch some of this game. I don't think she will watch any of it. But Duke Kaboom is doing the halftime show, so she might stick about for that.
There you go. I was not aware of that, but that is fun.
Yeah, so we're going to see that we get the London games early, so people remember to set those lineups early is another key point. You don't want to miss out on some opportunities, either positively or negatively, with that one. But that is going to do it for today's episode. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMartin. My co-host, as always, is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of Shawn's work up on RotoViz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.